The morning Amelia spilled hot coffee on a man worth more than most small countries, she had already decided it was going to be a bad day. Not in the dramatic sense. Nothing had collapsed. No one had called with terrible news. It was more of a feeling that settled somewhere behind her sternum around 6 a.m, when her alarm didn't go off, and she woke up 20 minutes late with her heart already pounding before she even opened her eyes. That particular kind of bad. The quiet, grinding kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates. She worked at the Langford, a private events venue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that specialized in the kind of gatherings most people never heard about. Corporate dinners for executives who didn't want press. Celebrations for families whose names appeared in financial news but never in social columns. Amelia had been a floor coordinator there for 3 years, and she was good at her job precisely because she understood one fundamental rule. Be useful, be invisible, be gone before anyone remembers you were there. It was a Thursday in late October. The venue had been booked for a private luncheon, 12 guests, a reserved dining room on the second floor, nothing unusual on paper. The client had reserved under a holding company name, which wasn't strange. Half their bookings came in that way. Amelia had reviewed the setup that morning, confirmed the floral arrangements, tested the sound system for the background music, briefed the 2 servers assigned to the room. Everything was in order by 11:15. She was carrying a tray with the pre-poured welcome beverages, a request from the client, 4 coffees and 2 teas, when the elevator opened directly in front of her. She wasn't expecting anyone to be on that elevator. The guests weren't scheduled to arrive for another 30 minutes. She had her head slightly down, watching the tray, and when the doors slid apart, she stepped forward purely by habit, the way she always crossed that particular stretch of hallway without looking up, because there was never anyone there at 11:17 on a setup morning. The collision was quiet, as disasters sometimes are. The tray tilted. 2 of the coffees went forward. She heard the sound before she fully processed what had happened. That specific, awful sound of liquid hitting fabric. And then she looked up. He wasn't looking at the coffee. He was looking at her. That was the first thing she registered, and it was the thing that stayed with her longer than it should have. Not the ruined suit. Not the 2 men flanking him who moved almost simultaneously. One reaching toward her as if she were a threat, the other scanning the hallway in both directions. Not the absolute stillness that seemed to radiate outward from him like heat from a surface that had been in the sun too long. He was looking at her, and his expression was completely unreadable. "I'm so sorry," Amelia said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I wasn't expecting. I'm so sorry, sir. Please let me." She was already reaching for the small towel tucked into her apron. The man to her left caught her wrist. Not hard, not aggressive, just stopped her, the way you stop a door from closing. Firm, certain, final. "Don't," he said quietly, and he wasn't talking to her. The grip released. Amelia stood very still. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. The man in front of her was young. Younger than she'd expected, given everything else about him. Late 20s, maybe 30 at the outside, with dark hair swept back and a face that was almost unsettlingly composed. The white shirt beneath his open jacket had 2 dark stains spreading across the front. The tattoos that climbed his neck were visible above his collar, intricate and dark, the kind of work that took years, and said something deliberate about the person wearing it. He still hadn't looked away from her. "Which room?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The Meridian room, sir. 2nd floor, east wing." She paused. "I can have someone bring a fresh. We have a dry cleaning service if you need. Send someone to the car for a shirt." He said this to the man on his right, who nodded once and turned without a word. Then he walked past her. No apology, no anger, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. His footsteps were even, unhurried, as if coffee didn't exist, as if she didn't exist, as if the small crisis had already been filed away somewhere and closed. Amelia stood in the hallway holding a tray with 2 empty glasses and her heart somewhere in her throat. The man on his left paused as he passed her. He was older, with a closely trimmed beard and the kind of posture that came from years of paying attention to everything. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, not unkindly, but with an assessment in it that made her feel briefly like a problem being calculated. "The Meridian Room setup," he said. "You're coordinating?" "Yes." "Stay on the floor." He moved on. She didn't know what that meant. Stay on the floor instead of what? Instead of going back downstairs? Instead of leaving? She stood there for another 3 seconds, tray in hand, trying to locate her professional composure, which seemed to have scattered somewhere between the elevator and the collision. She found it eventually. She always did. The luncheon proceeded without visible incident. Amelia stayed at the service station outside the Meridian Room as instructed, monitoring the servers through the small rectangular window in the door. The guests arrived in staggered pairs, quiet men in good suits, one woman who carried herself like she was used to rooms standing up when she entered. No one raised their voices. The conversation, what little she could catch, was conducted in the low tones of people who had nothing to prove to anyone in that room. He sat at the head of the table. She noticed, through that narrow window, how the room organized itself around him, without any visible effort on his part. People leaned slightly in his direction when they spoke. They waited. When he said something, and he didn't say much, the table went quieter, not louder. He had changed his shirt. The new one was the same white, perfectly fitted, as if someone had anticipated exactly this contingency. He didn't look toward the door. She told herself she wasn't watching him. She was monitoring the service, which was her job. She checked the water levels, noted when a bread basket needed replacing, watched the timing between courses. At 1:45, one of the servers came out with a slightly stricken expression that Amelia recognized. "He asked for you," the server. "Marcus, 22, 3 months on the job," said under his breath. "Who did?" Marcus glanced at the door. "The one at the head of the table." Amelia smoothed the front of her apron. She checked that the small notepad was in her pocket, an old habit. Then she opened the door. The room didn't go quiet when she entered. It was already quiet. But there was a subtle shift. A few glances. The woman with the commanding posture tracking her from across the table with an unreadable expression. He was looking at her again. "There was an issue with the coffee this morning," he said. His voice was even, low, calibrated to carry just far enough. "I want to make sure it didn't cause a problem for you." The question was so unexpected that for a half second she almost answered it honestly. "No, sir," she said instead. "No problem at all." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Not aggressive, not warm, something in between that she didn't have a name for. "Good," he said. And then, as simply as that, he looked back at the man he'd been speaking to before she entered. She was dismissed without being dismissed. She walked back to the door with careful, even steps, aware of every inch of floor between her and the exit. Back at the service station, she let out a breath so slow and deliberate it almost didn't count as exhaling. Marcus looked at her. What did he want? She thought about it for a moment. "I genuinely have no idea," she said. And that was the truth. But it was also, she realized, the beginning of something she didn't yet have words for. The first thread of attention that would, over the weeks that followed, pull tighter and tighter until she couldn't remember what it had felt like before it existed. She just didn't know that yet. He came back the following Thursday. Amelia found out the way she found out about most things at the Langford, through the booking system, at 7:15 in the morning, when she was still on her first coffee, and the venue was empty, except for the cleaning crew finishing up on the ground floor. The reservation appeared under the same holding company name, Meridian Room, 12:30. 8 guests this time. She told herself the small, uncomfortable alertness she felt was professionalism, preparation. She was a coordinator. It was her job to notice details, to anticipate, to be ready. She reviewed the setup twice. He arrived at 12:20, 10 minutes early, with 3 men instead of 2. The older one with the beard was there again. She'd learned from Marcus, who had a talent for gathering information without appearing to, that the man's name was Mr. Cho, and that he seemed to function as something between an assistant and a shadow. The other 2 she didn't recognize. They swept the hallway in a way that was almost subtle, almost casual, and would have fooled her completely if she hadn't been paying attention. She was paying attention. This time there was no collision. She was standing at the service station when the elevator opened, clipboard in hand, and she looked up at exactly the right moment, or the wrong one, depending on how she chose to frame it later. He saw her immediately. There was a half-second where she could have looked down, redirected her attention to the clipboard, performed the kind of professional invisibility she had spent 3 years perfecting. She didn't. She met his gaze and gave a small, practiced nod, the kind she gave to all clients. Measured, courteous, impersonal. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Not quite. More like a door opening a fraction of an inch. Barely perceptible. Gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. "Ms." He paused. "Amelia," she said. "I'm coordinating today's event." Amelia. He said her name the way someone picks up an unfamiliar object, carefully testing its weight. Then he walked past her toward the room. She didn't move for 3 full seconds after he passed. The luncheon went smoothly. More smoothly than the previous week even, which she attributed to the fact that she'd briefed Marcus more thoroughly and confirmed the kitchen timing twice. But she was aware, with a consistency that bothered her, of the closed door at the end of the hall, of the muffled, low conversation she could occasionally hear through it, of the way the room seemed to generate its own gravity. At 2:10, Mr. Cho came to the service station. "Mr. Kwan would like the room for an additional 45 minutes, he said. "Is that possible?" Amelia checked her schedule. The room was free until 5. "Of course." Mr. Cho nodded. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her with that same careful, calculating attention he'd given her the week before. "You're good at your job," he said, in a tone that made it sound less like a compliment and more like a fact he was logging. "Thank you," she said. He noticed. A pause. That's not common. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and Mr. Cho seemed to consider that an acceptable answer. He returned to the room. She stood at the service station and tried very hard not to think about what that meant. The 3rd Thursday followed the same pattern. Then the 4th. By the 5th week, Amelia had stopped pretending to herself that the reservations were coincidental or routine. The Langford had dozens of coordinators. There had been a deliberate request. She didn't know how she knew this, but she knew that she specifically handled these bookings. She knew his name now. Seungmin Kwon. She hadn't looked him up, had resisted it with a stubbornness she recognized as self-protective, but she'd heard it enough times in passing fragments of conversation to have assembled the outline. The holding company was real and legitimate, and very large. What sat beneath it was something else, something that people at the Langford referred to in the careful, sideways language of people who understood that some things were better left unnamed. She understood the language. She didn't push at the edges of it. What she did do, on the 5th Thursday, was notice that he watched her. Not constantly, not obviously. But when she came into the room to oversee a course change, to address a minor issue with one of the servers, she could feel it. A kind of attention that was different from the way other clients looked at staff. Most people looked through service workers the way they looked through windows. Seungmin Kwon looked at her the way someone looks at something they're trying to understand. It made her feel, alternately, like she was being honored and like she was being catalogued. On the 5th Thursday, when the guests had gone and the servers were clearing the table, he was still in the room. She came in to do her end-of-event walkthrough, another habit, checking for forgotten items, damage, anything that needed to be flagged, and found him standing at the window that overlooked the small courtyard below. He was alone, which was unusual. She almost backed out. "I can come back," You don't have to. He didn't turn around. I wanted to ask you something. She stayed near the door. Of course. Do you eat dinner? The question was so plainly stated, so stripped of any performance, that she almost laughed, not from amusement, from the sheer unexpectedness of it. Yes. Generally. Now he turned. His expression was the same contained, unreadable thing it always was, except that there was something underneath it. Something deliberate. Tomorrow evening. There's a restaurant on 64th Street, Sora. 8 o'clock. It wasn't precisely an invitation. It wasn't precisely a command. It existed in some careful space between the two. Amelia thought about every sensible thing she knew. About professional boundaries. About the particular kind of dangerous that came with a certain kind of man. About the fact that she had a good, stable, carefully constructed life that she had built slowly and on her own terms, and that nothing about Seungmin Kwon suggested he respected carefully constructed things. I don't think that would be appropriate, she said. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. He held her gaze throughout it. Why not? He said. Not a question, an invitation to elaborate. You're a client. She kept her voice even. It's a conflict of interest. I'm not a client after today. He paused. I won't be booking this venue again. She stared at him. Why? Because I have what I needed from it. The way he said it, quietly, without any apparent awareness of how it sounded, sent a current through her that she couldn't immediately classify as either alarm or something warmer. Possibly both. Probably both. Mr. Kwon, Seungmin. That's not really. 8 o'clock, he said. You can decide by then. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked past her to the door. The two men who materialized from the hallway, she hadn't even heard them there, fell into position beside him without a word. At the door, he paused. He didn't look back, but he paused. I'll have someone confirm the reservation in your name, he said, in case you decide to come. Then he was gone. Amelia stood in the empty Meridian room for a long time. The courtyard outside the window was gray and quiet, a few last October leaves collecting against the stone border. The table still held the ghost of the afternoon, linen slightly displaced, water glasses half empty, the particular stillness of a room that had recently held people, and now held only their absence. She didn't know what she was going to do. That was a lie, actually. Some part of her, the part that had been paying careful, reluctant attention for 5 Thursdays in a row, already knew. She was going to go. She was going to walk into that restaurant on 64th Street at 8 o'clock, and she was going to sit across from a man whose world operated by entirely different rules than hers. And she was going to do it with her eyes open and her hands steady and that particular composure she had spent years learning to maintain. What she couldn't predict, what frightened her more than anything else about the situation, was what happened after that. Sora was the kind of restaurant that didn't need to advertise. There was no sign above the door, just a small brushed metal plate with the name in lowercase letters. The kind of understated detail that communicated everything to the people it was meant for and nothing to anyone else. A man in a dark coat opened the door before Amelia reached it, which meant someone had been watching the street. She filed that away without reacting to it. Inside, the lighting was low and amber, the tables spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private without any effort. The room smelled of cedar and something floral she couldn't identify. Soft music moved through the space like water, present but directionless, impossible to locate its source. Every surface was dark wood, or stone, or matte black. The effect was beautiful in a way that felt slightly like pressure. The hostess smiled at her with the particular warmth of someone who had been told to expect her. Ms. Amelia, right this way. She was led to a table near the back, half recessed into an alcove that offered a clear view of the entrance without being visible from most of the room. She noticed this immediately. The position was not chosen for ambiance. It was chosen for sightlines. Seungmin was already there. He stood when she approached, which surprised her. It was such a simple gesture, almost old-fashioned, and it didn't fit neatly into the image she had been quietly assembling of him. He was wearing a dark jacket over a black shirt, no tie, and the tattoos at his neck were visible above the collar, that intricate, climbing ink that she had been careful not to stare at during the Thursdays at the Langford, and found herself noticing again now. "You came," he said. "I said I'd decide by 8, she said. "I decided." The ghost of something crossed his face. She was starting to learn how to read the small variations in his stillness, how a slight shift near his eyes meant something different than a shift near his mouth. It wasn't a smile. What happened then? But it was adjacent to one. They sat. The dinner was not what she expected, and she couldn't have said what she had expected exactly, only that this wasn't it. He asked her questions, real ones, not the performative interest of someone filling silence. How long she had lived in New York, whether she had chosen event coordination or arrived at it sideways, the way most people arrived at what they did, what she thought about the city in October versus the city in summer, which was a stranger question than it sounded, and one she found herself answering at length without meaning to. He listened the way very few people listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. She was careful. She kept herself measured. But somewhere around the second hour, somewhere between the entrees and a silence that settled comfortably rather than awkwardly, she became aware of a loosening, something in her posture, in the distance she'd been maintaining, and she pulled it back deliberately. "You ask a lot of questions," she said. "You answer them," he said. "I'm trying to figure out why." He turned his glass slightly on the table. "Because you're honest. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. Most people probably have good reasons for that," she said carefully. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "They do." It was the first time he had acknowledged, without naming it, the particular shape of his world. The acknowledgement was so minimal, so precise, that she almost missed it. But she didn't.